Good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us. Um, Today's engagement session is on the 2021 city budget. My name is Julia Lee Stitt, and I'm a corporate communications officer at the city, and I will be moderating this online engagement. We had 34 individuals RSVP for today's session. So a few housekeeping items. Today's session is live streamed to the City of Kingston's YouTube channel, and it will be recorded, so it will be accessible there after this event. And it is also live closed caption. To protect your privacy and the privacy of all participants, your video has been turned off and you have been muted, and the chat functionality in Zoom is also turned off. That means that anything that you enter into the chat function will only be visible to panelists. And in the next slide, I'll touch on how we'll be using that tool for this engagement session. Technology. So sometimes we know technology troubles happen, and there are a list of common challenges, and we've actually outlined them as well as the solutions at www.getinvolved.cityofkingston.ca. So if you find you are running into technology problems, I invite you to go to that site. You can also adjust your video view options, which is quite nice, so that you're able to see the presenter as well as the presentation. And just one moment. Well, on the topic of technology troubles happening, hi everyone, thank you for your patience. So this slide is pretty perfect for what I was just experiencing. So technology troubles can happen, and as I mentioned, we will be doing our best to help you resolve them as they come up, but we do have a list of resources on Get Involved, which you can access at www.getinvolved.cityofkingston.ca. Sometimes the easiest option is to simply log off and rejoin the meeting. Also, you have the option to call in. So just take a second and maybe jot down the number on the screen so that if you find you're having some internet connectivity issues, then you can join us by phone. And of course, there's always the option to follow along on YouTube. All right. When it comes to asking questions, you can enter your question into the chat tool, into the Q&A area at any point in the presentation. However, we are going to be taking questions at the end of the session. The Q&A feature can be found on the bar across the bottom of the screen, and the project team is going to be doing their very best to get to all of the questions during today's session. Please note, if we are unable to get to all of the questions, all the answers will be summarized by the project team and posted on the Get Involved Kingston site. And we're aiming to have those posted within a couple of weeks. And I just want to remind individuals that there is a survey currently open on Get Involved Kingston. It does close November 13th, which is this Friday. So please take the time to visit our project page on Get Involved and complete the survey prior to November 13th at 4 p.m. If you are calling in and you have a question, then again, that will be saved for the end of the session, but you are going to press *6, at which point I would unmute you and you would pose your question. So these are the City of Kingston's guidelines for participation. I'm going to leave this slide up on the screen for a moment. Is there anything additional that anyone in attendance would like to have added to the guidelines for this engagement session? If you're not in agreement, we would ask that you would please use the raise hand function. Okay. Seeing no hands raised, we will move forward. I am now going to be passing this presentation over to our Chief Financial Officer and City Treasurer, Desiree Kennedy, and Lana Foulds, who is the Director of Financial Services and Deputy Treasurer.
Thanks, Julie Lee. And Julie Lee, I think you're going to have to be managing the slides. Thanks. So welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Our first online budget engagement open house, and we're glad that you could attend. Hopefully we can provide some information today, get some feedback that'll be useful as the city undertakes its 2021 budget process. Next slide, Julie. In terms of the agenda today, I'm going to start by just going a step back and talking a little bit about how we got here and our open budget process and the direction that Council has given staff around this. We'll then take a little bit of a look at the city budgets, the guiding principles and constraints on the process, things that we need to consider as we're developing operating and capital budgets. Then going to turn it over to Lana Foulds, who's going to get into a bit more detail on our operating and our capital budgets and what makes up some of those, the elements of those. A bit of information on next steps, and then we'll have some time at the end for questions and answers, as Julie Lee has mentioned. Next slide. So in terms of an open budget process, there was a report that went to Council in July, subsequent to Council directing staff to recommend that an open budget process be implemented for the 2021 budget. And an open process offers citizens an opportunity to learn about the budget and the budget process, but more importantly, to provide input on the priorities and to influence the allocation of our public resources, both our financial resources and our people resources. Information and outreach is an essential component of a public engagement process so that we can ensure that the interaction is effective and that feedback is constructive. And that's certainly our objective today with this engagement, online engagement process, is to provide some of that information and outreach. The July Council report presented actually a multi-phased budget engagement plan. It's based on the city's overall public engagement framework, which is used for numerous project engagements. And it has a focus on both, as I said, informative elements as well as a consultative engagement. So it does a bit of both pieces. It's really important to note today that the open budget process is not just a one-time start and stop for each budget. It's an ongoing, it's an iterative process. You're going to hear from my colleague today about how we prepare multi-year budgets here at the city, and the budget engagement process is similar to that. So feedback that we may get today or in the next may not influence the current year's budget. It may actually influence an interactive process. Next slide. In terms of the scope of the budget engagement, the municipal budgeting process is a very broad concept, and there's a lot of inputs that can go into a budget development. Certainly can benefit from public input on a variety of fronts and results in many perspectives as to what budget engagement would look like. So staff have actually categorized our engagement, again, our multi-year engagement, into 4 different types of levels of engagement and looking at different types of information around strategic priorities and investment, looking at service levels and how they align to citizens' preferences, looking at performance, so looking at our services and our performance improvements, looking at cost savings, areas where we might be more efficient. And then probably what people are most used to right now is project specific. So where we've done specific engagements on certain projects. And all of these elements feed into a budget at the end of the day. Next slide. So I'd like to move into some of the budgeting concepts and the constraints that influence the budget decisions that council makes. Next slide. And I'd like to start with this illustration that illustrates how the budgets fit into the rest of the corporate planning framework. And as you can see, budgeting is only one component of a much broader planning framework. And it's actually the final step in the planning process because it provides the financial resources to achieve those strategic priorities and the service levels that have previously been decided on. You can see here in this planning framework that we start with the community. And so this is community engagement. It may be engagement on other opportunities that we've had on Get Involved Kingston. Things like more recently, we had a council priorities refresh. We've had an engagement on design features on transit stations, climate leadership plan, and how we're going to reach some of our GHG reduction targets. So a number of things that will all eventually feed into the budget process. We then have council's strategic and service priorities. So that information all goes to council. Council has deliberations throughout the year and ongoing around our service levels and our service priorities, as well as a corporate strategic plan that is set once every council term and then updated throughout the term that sets the high-level strategic priorities for the corporation. Again, those are all then reflected in the annual budget approvals. So the council strategic priorities, we do have a 4-year strategic plan. You can find it on the city's website along with progress updates on how we've been meeting some of the objectives and the implementation of some of the work plans. The 4-year strategic plan guides council's decision making, our policy development, and then when we talk about budget, it guides our resource allocation in terms of budget as well as people in terms of achieving the strategic plans and the work plan items. You can see on the slide the 5 categories of council's strategic priorities, and within each of these categories, there's a work plan that then determines the resources that need to be allocated against those items. Next slide. So council can deliberate and approve priorities and service levels, but not without consideration for the fiscal realities. So not unlike we prioritize our personal expenditures, we may have a long list of priorities, but a little shorter list in terms of financial resources. And they can then dictate what our abilities are to spend what we'd like to spend and what we'd like to spend it on. So one of the things that council does as part of its strategic planning early on is it sets some fiscal direction for staff and creates some of these fiscal constraints that we have to consider and work within when we're not only talking about our service levels and our priorities, but also when we're developing the budget. There's 3 parameters that council has outlined. First is tax rate increases, and council has set maximum tax increase targets for each of the 4 years of its term. For 2021, we're looking at a maximum tax increase target of 2.4%, which is 1.4% for operations plus 1% for capital. The second parameter that council outlines is a continued investment in infrastructure. So of that 2.4% tax increase target, as I said, 1% is for the capital levy, and that's the amounts that are going into our capital funds to support our capital assets and the investment in those assets. There's a the levy is very important in terms of maintaining our infrastructure because that's the infrastructure that's going to support our programs and services. And we'll hear more about that later. The final constraint is our debt limits. And we will be talking about this later in the presentation, but council has approved some self-imposed debt limits that are below legislated debt limits. And again, in terms of some of our capital budget, we need to keep these thresholds in mind as we're developing the budget. Next slide. Moving on, in terms of influencing budget decisions, the corporation also has a number of master plans and other long-term studies which guide the operations and the respective service levels. These plans are all available on the city's website if you'd like to look at any of them. And for most of them, whenever we're updating, we do have public engagement on these plans. So residents and the community has an opportunity to weigh in on these studies and plans. They're long-term perspective documents, so they support long-term planning decisions in sort of a consistent and formal manner, rather than just making short-term reactive decisions. So they do this by helping us to identify priorities that are based on our community's needs, which is where the engagement piece comes in, ensuring consideration for our future demands and growth. So certainly the long-term perspective, outlining the resources required so that things can be adequately planned and planned well in advance, instead of short-term planning. And as I said, providing opportunity for the public input. So they guide the long-term direction of the corporation and help us to determine what the needs and the priorities are as we're developing the budget. Next slide. Just a few other budget influences and requirements. So certainly the municipality is legislated under the Ontario Municipal Act. We are here at the pleasure of the province of Ontario, and certainly there are a number of legislative requirements that we have to follow in that regard. When we think about the budget and the service levels that influence that budget, we have to have consideration for things like minimum maintenance standards for our roads and sidewalks, building code requirements, health and safety of our public and staff, just to name a few of those requirements. We also need to consider our asset management planning. So as I said, we do have capital infrastructure that's in place that supports our services and programs, and you'll hear a little bit more about that later on. And certainly that has to play into our budget development in terms of ensuring that we are investing at the right levels into our capital assets. The final thing that is a little more specific for us for 2021, and certainly has been an impact in 2020 on our budget levels, is COVID-19. And certainly that pandemic has had an effect on us. There was a report that went to council September 15th. It's on the website if anyone's interested in taking a look at the detail of it. It goes into some discussion on the challenges that the city has faced from a budget perspective in 2020. It reports about $22 million in a shortfall of revenues, as we've had facilities that have had to close down, or we've had to implement social distancing factors. It also talks about increased preventative costs and things that we've had to do around cleaning, barriers, and other protective measures. And we see that this is going to move into our 2021 budget. We are in stage 3, which means we do still have some restrictions around our services and our service levels, which will mean reduced revenues in our 2021 budget from what we normally would be budgeting, and certainly additional preventative costs as we move through 2021. So those will be factors that council will have to consider as we develop and approve the 2021 budget. And then finally, in terms of just some other legislative requirements that are fiscal related. So as I said, we are creatures of the province. And it's a reference to the fact that we're located under provincial jurisdiction in the Canadian Constitution. So under some of our fiscal legislation, municipalities have to have balanced budgets. So when we do our budgets, we have to have enough revenue to cover off our budgeted expenditures. If we do run a deficit at the end of the year, that amount has to be raised by taxation in the following year to cover that deficit. So unlike other entities, we cannot carry forward an accumulated deficit. In terms of some of our borrowing, there are some restrictions around how we can borrow for operating purposes, and levels that we cannot exceed that are based on our budgeted revenues, as well as our long-term debt limits. And we'll talk a bit about our debt later on. But in terms of some of the debt that we're issuing for capital purposes, there are provincial limits that we cannot exceed. And as I mentioned, council has approved actually a lower self-imposed limit that's less than the provincial guidelines or provincial legislation that we have to consider. So I'm now going to turn it over to Lana Foulds, and Lana's going to provide us some information on the city's multi-year budgeting framework and take a closer look at some of the components that make up our operating and our capital budgets.
Thank you, Desiree. Budgeting at the city is a cyclical process, with budgets being presented to council for deliberation, typically in November. Next slide, please, Julie Lee. The budget discussion included in this presentation centers around the municipal tax budget requirements. Utilities Kingston budgets are prepared separately and are funded through collection of user rates for water, wastewater, gas operations, and the appliance rental program. The city operating budget includes 4 years, the current year for budget deliberation, and 3 forecast years. Benefits of the multi-year operating budget are recognizing and understanding funding and expenditure patterns, the ability to forecast expected changes over time to funding or services, and efficiencies created in the budgeting process by regularly updating assumptions versus starting from scratch. The capital budget is forecasted over a 15-year period, with the current year for deliberation and approval. 15-year forecasts allow for staff to create coinciding funding models that can be monitored and updated. Other benefits to this approach are the ability to anticipate annual asset management financial requirements and the planning of resource allocations. Engineering and transportation services receive a multi-year capital approval to enable collaboration with other asset groups, specifically Utilities Kingston. This maximizes resources and reduces the remediation and replacement of assets before the end of their useful lives. Next slide, please. The annual collection of revenues, such as taxes, are divided into 2, to support annual operating expenditures and a portion redirected to capital reserve funds. Through the approved council strategic priorities, the total 2021 tax increase is 2.4%. 1.4% to offset operating expenditures, and 1% as per policy to capital reserve funds. Capital expenditures are then funded internally through the reserve fund monies, either through a pay-as-you-go model or repayment of a long-term debt issued. Next slide, please. Now we will discuss the operating budget. Next slide, please. An operating budget outlines estimates for revenues and expenditures associated with the day-to-day operations of the city's services for the fiscal year. It also confirms what the city will spend on programs and services such as transit, garbage and recycling collection, parks, recreation programs, and road maintenance. It also allocates funding to achieve council's policy decisions and direction. Next slide, please. The city has 23 departments that provide over 80 different programs and services, not including Utilities Kingston or the 10 agencies and boards. Utilities Kingston operates the municipal utilities, water, wastewater, gas operations, and the appliance rental program. These utilities are funded through user rates collected, not property taxes. Utilities Kingston present these budgets separately for council approval. The agencies and boards have separate governing bodies that request a budget allocation to council for deliberation. They provide services to the community like library, tourism marketing, accessible transit, and policing. The challenge is trying to balance the varying demands with the revenues available. Next slide, please. Billions of dollars of infrastructure and assets are managed to provide services. Roads, sidewalks, vehicles, and facilities are but a few of these assets. They must be maintained to ensure the appropriate service standards and minimize risk. Next slide, please. There are 3 major sources of operating revenues collected by the city. Revenues are income generated to support expenditures. The primary source collected by the city is taxation at 65% of the overall budget. 20% from provincial and federal subsidies, and 15% from user fees and recoveries. Next slide, please. Taxation is the largest source of municipal revenue. The tax levy is based on the net tax requirement of the operating budget, the total gross budget less other revenues expected. The collection of the taxes by property is determined through the assessment value methodology. This methodology allows distribution in a consistent manner. Assessment is the property value assigned by the Municipal Property Assessment Corporation, known as MPAC. Assessment growth represents new construction or other additional assessment value that is added to the tax roll. Supplemental taxes are a result of new construction or property changes during the year. Assessment growth does not result in more income for the city. It does mean a reduced tax rate to the existing taxpayers. In the illustration presented, it can be seen that the net tax requirement is $260 million. If an increase or decrease is made to any of the components, such as assessment growth, the offsetting change would be made to the tax levy. The net taxation requirement remaining at $260 million. Federal and provincial governments pay taxes through payment in lieu of tax calculations. Federal calculations are based on the assessment times a tax rate, and provincial through a heads and beds tax levy. Next slide, please. User fees are fees collected according to bylaw for services or programs rendered directly. They are recoveries for services and programs that have a direct user benefit, such as transit fares, parking fees, and ice rentals. Most services are supported by some tax subsidy. This implies that the services that have some portion of user and community benefit. User fees are adjusted annually by the Consumer Price Index, plus 1% for capital purposes where applicable. This ensures a consistent split proportion between user fees and the tax subsidy. Grants and subsidies are the financial support from other levels of government. The city administers programs such as the Ontario Works Income Support, housing and childcare support that transfer payments to recipients. Other subsidies are received to support long-term care, transit, and recycling, to name a few. Next slide. Operating expenditures are the costs expected to deliver programs, services, and manage assets. There are 5 major expenditure categories in the city budget. Salaries and benefits at 32% of the gross budget, supplies, materials, and contracted services at 15%, grants and transfers to other at 16%, transfers to reserve funds at 19%, and agency and board transfers at 18%. Next slide. Salary and benefits include wages, benefits, payroll allowances, and WSIB costs for all full-time, part-time, and contract employees, including the summer student program. Most of the city's workforce are unionized and governed by collective agreements. Collective agreements are negotiated between the city and unions and provide wage and benefit obligations for a specified term. Supplies, materials, and contracted services are costs incurred to deliver services. There are a variety of costs to support the many programs. However, some of the larger costs include fuel, utilities, insurance premium, salt and sand, and fleet parts. External resources are budgeted to provide some portion of services delivered. They include, to name a few, property assessment by MPAC, waste and recycling collection, and snow plowing and removal services. Many are mandated to be provided by external sources, such as MPAC and insurance premiums. Other services can be provided in a more cost-effective manner by external contractors because the service is specialized in nature or the city does not have the resources internally. Grants and transfers to others are linked with the grants and subsidies received from the federal and provincial governments, such as Ontario Works income subsidies, childcare services, and housing supports. Transfers to others are over 80% of the provincial and federal government grants and subsidies received. Transfer to reserve and reserve funds are primarily to support capital programs. The annual federal gas tax allotment is also transferred to the reserve fund for capital initiatives. There are also transfers to operating reserves to support unpredictable and unforeseen events that can arise in the fiscal year and to provide stability to the operating program. Also included in the annual gross operating expenditures are the budget requests for the 10 agencies and boards that provide services to the community. Next slide. Included in the budgeted tax levy is a portion for capital purposes. The purposes of this levy are to support long-term asset management, ensure sustainability of infrastructure, reduce the infrastructure deficit, and reduce the reliance on long-term debt. Funds are transferred annually to capital reserve funds. Currently, the amount from taxes is approximately $40 million and $25 million from other sources such as user fees. These levies are increased annually by 1% of the taxation levy. Next slide, please. The capital budget. Next slide, please. A capital budget outlines the city's plans to support and fund capital assets like buses, snowplows, buildings, streets, pathways, and other infrastructure that support the delivery of programs and services. Capital budgets include costs and related sources of funding to maintain, replace, and refurbish these kinds of assets over their useful lives. Next slide, please. Capital projects are comprised of three types. Asset management, which provides funding for capital maintenance, replacement, and renewal. Studies and plans, and growth, which are new assets. Capital projects support asset classes such as roads and bridges, pathways, trails, and sidewalks, buildings, land and parks, transit buses and fleet, and equipment and technology. Capital projects are prioritized by the investment in existing asset management requirements and strategic priorities. Next slide, please. Capital projects expenditures must be predetermined funding sources to be approved by Council. Included in the 15-year plans provided to Council for deliberation are the gross project budget expenditures of a department with the funding summarized at the bottom. There are four primary sources of funding: from the reserve funds, known as pay-as-you-go, grant funding from the federal and provincial governments, long-term debt, and external recoveries. Desiree will take her turn and explain these funding sources in more detail.
Thanks, Lana. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of the capital funding, particularly our internal sources and some of our long-term plans around this in terms of how they will influence the capital budget process. So besides some of the external contributions that Lana mentioned in the form of grants and other external revenues, the primary funding sources of our capital investment are capital reserve funds, as Lana mentioned, where we raise funds prior to spending the capital dollars, called pay-as-you-go. Not unlike you would have a savings account where you would save money up and then purchase something like a car. Or we can issue debt where we borrow funds and repay over the term of debt, not unlike you would do something in terms of buying a house and taking out a mortgage. So in terms of our reserves and reserve funds, they are monies that are set aside to address capital funding strategies, similar to a savings account. Those funds are used either to pay as you go, the capital expenditures, or they're used to pay debt repayment costs where we have chosen to issue debt. Some of our reserves and reserve funds are also used to manage unanticipated expenses that might come along and to support the city's longer term financial stability so that we don't have the variances happening year to year. As Lana mentioned, the monies are received from the operating budget each year, as well as other contributions and the investment income that goes into the capital reserves that are earned on the fund balances. We hold, without the utility pieces, we hold about $130 million in our reserves, which represents about maybe just over 1 year's worth of average capital expenditures. The reserve funds and our models that go along with them certainly illustrate the importance of the 1% capital levy that we have measured. There is an objective in terms of our long-term financing strategies to rely more on the pay-as-you-go, so to save those funds. next slide. Thank you. To save those funds up in terms of spending them, as opposed to relying on the debt. And I'm going to talk a bit about that in terms of where we're trying to go in terms of our capital funding strategies. So when we go a step back to amalgamation, when the municipalities came together, what had happened in most municipal areas, this certainly wasn't specific to the city of Kingston, there was a large capital deficit that we were dealing with. So assets had not been maintained. They needed some investment of monies to bring them back to a sustainable level. And so council at the time passed a couple of motions. One, that they wanted to start to use some debt to try to increase the investment in these assets. And then two, to implement the 1% capital levy, where we could start to build up the reserve funds to a level where we would get to a point where we would no longer need to rely on debt unless it was appropriate in the circumstances. So the objective was to increase the use of the pay-as-you-go funding using our capital reserve funds and to use debt in the early years to address the infrastructure deficits, with a longer-term strategy to get to a point where we're using pay-as-you-go for our asset maintenance and renewal investments and a limited reliance on debt. Next slide. Oh, sorry, one back. So in terms of our long-term debt, our debt funding objectives, as I said, increased reliance on the pay-as-you-go. We do need to, when we're issuing debt, to think about affordability and financially sustainable in terms of being able to make those debt payments. As I mentioned earlier, we do have self-imposed limits, and I'll illustrate that when we get to the next slide. And we have some statutory requirements that we certainly have to be considering when we're determining how we're going to be funding some of the capital budget. We do want to maintain an appropriate balance in our capital reserve funds, and our 1% levy continues to help us grow those to the point where we will get to an appropriate balance to have in those funds so that we can be using pay-as-you-go methods for funding of all our asset management costs. And lastly, we do want to maintain a strong credit rating, and I will talk about that in a subsequent slide in terms of the city's current credit rating. There are a couple of reports that I can refer you to that are on the city's website around debt. There was a report that went to council last fall that has a lot of detail in the debt management plan and summarizes some of what I have just mentioned around going back to amalgamation and what the long-term strategy has been in terms of our capital funding. There's also an annual report that goes to council that outlines our municipal debt, what we currently have, what's been approved but not yet issued, and how that relates to the self-imposed limits and the provincial limits that we are subject to. Next slide. So in terms of our current debt, this slide illustrates our debt forecast. And you can see there's a couple of thresholds that are on here. There's a red line at the very top, and that represents the provincial threshold and that we cannot go over in terms of our debt levels. The green line is the self-imposed line that council has approved. And this is based on what we feel the city can afford today. It's based on things like interest rates, the risk of debt and the change in interest rates, our reserve fund models and our balances and what we can rely on there. So there's a number of factors that go into determining this self-imposed threshold. You can see that over the next couple of years, we're going up very close to our threshold, and then we start to come back. And if I could have put earlier years on, you would have seen back to amalgamation where we had very low debt and we were building up to this point and then starting to come back down, which is exactly the strategy that council had approved back in around 2000, 2001. And you can see now that we're reaching those top limits, and then we'll be starting to come back down. We do pay about $18 to $20 million a year of principal payments, which helps in terms of bringing these back down. I can also say that for this term of council, at this point, there is no plan to issue any new debt during this term of council. So we have really started to cross over that threshold where we'll now only be using debt for either some of our larger projects or projects that are related to growth. And some of the strategies around the use of debt for that is we want to think about, in terms of things like growth assets, who is paying for those debt charges at the end of the day. So if we pick maybe one of our largest projects, our largest project, the Third Crossing, which has about 100-year life, does it make sense that all the taxpayers of today should be paying for that? Or should some of the taxpayers that are going to be driving on that bridge tomorrow be paying for it? So part of that project is funded by pay as you go, and part of it is funded by debt, so that the future users that are getting the benefit will also be paying for a portion of that service. Next slide. So I mentioned the city does have an annual credit rating process that it goes through. We have Standard & Poor's rating agency that looks at a number of our policies and our financial management tools each year in terms of giving this credit rating. We do have a AA credit rating right now, and that is it's a high rating, and it's certainly a validation of our capital funding strategies and the other fiscal policies that we've discussed today. And it's coming from it's an external opinion and a third-party credit rating agency. So it's certainly an external validation of what we're doing. Standard & Poor's annual review considers a broad range of factors in evaluating the creditworthiness of the municipality. They look at things like the strength and stability of our local economy, our management and governance practices, and that includes council and the way that council approves and governs some of the financial management tools. It looks at our staffing composition, our financial policies, our budgetary performance, certainly our debt balances and our ability to repay those balances, and our liquidity position. So they certainly look at a number of things in terms of determining what that credit rating is, and that high credit rating tells the investors that we are a worthwhile organization to invest in terms of our ability to be able to repay our debt. The most recent report from Standard & Poor's certainly mentioned and validated our fiscal policies and approach and our strong financial management practices. Our debt burden as moderate, despite an increasing capital program that we've had over a number of years. And from a community perspective, they've noted our significant public sector employment and our high institutional stability in the community, which certainly has been of help in terms of some times, particularly the turbulence of the last few months that we've had. Next slide. So in terms of next steps, we will be moving into the Q&A session next. And in terms of some of the information that we're getting back in our whole budget engagement process, we will be summarizing the feedback for our senior management teams as part of the budget development process that is happening right now. There will be a council report that will be going back later in December to council that will summarize some of the feedback for council's consideration prior to the budget deliberations, and to illustrate how some of the input has been used to inform either the current budget, or I would say more importantly, our future budget projections. As Lana said, we do have 4-year operating and 15-year capital, and so some of that input will certainly be influencing the future years. In terms of our budget timetable, budgets are being worked on right now with senior staff and the departments, and we'll be planning to go to council sometime late January, early February in terms of a draft budget that's been based on the direction and the parameters that council has previously given to us. And I think it's worth noting, it's certainly, I'm sure people are feeling it's a little bit tight in terms of the timing, and you would be correct if you're thinking that. Which, going back to where I started when we talked about a multi-phase budget engagement process, our plan is to take some of this feedback to get our 2021 budgets underway, but then to really think about what are our next steps with budget engagement. So we will be back with a phase 2 budget engagement as we start to think very early in the new year about what 2022 and 2023 budgets might look like. And that will certainly be a little little better timing for us in terms of getting onto an annual recurring process for budget engagement. And Julie Lee, back to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Desiree and Lana. That was excellent. We did cover a lot of information. So I invite you all, if you have a question, please submit it using the Q&A tool. And again, if you're calling in and you have a question, just press *6 and we'll see you and we'll enable your audio and you'll be able to ask your question. So to access the Q&A, you should be able to you should see it in the bottom of your screen and be able to pose a question there. We have quite a bit of time, well, about an hour to take your questions, which is great. So any questions that we don't get to, we will be responding to through our Get Involved Kingston platform. So I do see questions are coming in. So Joanne has asked, what is the timeline? So I see, Joanne, you have a number of questions. So in terms of the timeline, are you referring to the timeline of the engagement process? Maybe if you could just add some more detail using the Q&A function, then we could answer that as best we are able to. The timeline of this meeting. Okay, excellent. Well, I may have just answered your question, Joanne. So you can see that we went over the presentation. There's a lot of information there. So if anyone has any questions about what we covered, now would be the time to ask. And yes, so then I see you have another question here. How is the climate crisis leadership of the city and the housing priority reflected in the 2020 budget? I find homelessness an unacceptable thing in our city. So Joanne, that is an excellent question. It's not something that we're going to be covering here live today. It is probably a question that would go to the city departments. So thank you for posing it, but I do believe that it falls a little bit outside the scope of this engagement session today. Again, this is really a process that we're building on. So in this first phase of engagement, we're really looking to inform our residents, to provide a common understanding so that as we engage moving forward, we're all on the same page. So you do have another question, Joanne. Can you identify some of the agencies and boards you were referring to? Absolutely. And to answer that, I'm going to turn it over to Desiree Kennedy.
Thanks, Julie Lee. So I'm actually going to override you. I'm just going to go back to the other question. Certainly Julie Lee is right, and we don't have a lot of that detail today, and we'll certainly make sure we do have it when we post the Q&A at the end of the day. But what I can say is certainly both climate crisis leadership and housing are priorities in the current strategic plan for council. And so in the 2020 budget, there are a number of areas that reference and that support both of these initiatives in terms of providing some financial resources. And I can actually refer you on the city website under the budget page. We do have a lot of information on the 2020 budget, including our budget presentation last year, information from each of the departments and the commissioners around what's in the budget and where they're going. Some of their work plan items, and you will see in there quite a bit of information on both of those initiatives. The other thing that I can say in that regard is just recently, Council updated their strategic priorities, taking a look at it with the lens of the pandemic and some of the restrictions maybe that we've had around trying to get some of the strategic priority work plans completed. But I can tell you that both of these items, there was strong approval that these remain in the strategic plan, that they continue to be priorities, and that we do continue to fund them. And I think certainly on the homelessness issue, that has come to light even more through the pandemic. So certainly moving into 2021, we will certainly see that. So I think I'm going to actually throw the agencies and boards over to Lana, and she can answer that question.
Thank you. All right, the 10 agencies and boards referenced in my presentation are the Kingston Economic Development Corporation, Tourism Kingston, Cataraqui Region Conservation Authority, the KFLNA Public Health Unit, Kingston Access Services, the Library Board, the Police Services Board, the County of Frontenac, the Hospital Foundation, and Downtown Business Improvement Area. Thank you.
Perfect. So thank you for those questions, Joanne, and thank you, Desiree, for overriding me. That was great information. So we have another question from Tara, and it is, given that the budget is already set with self-imposed debt limits and statutory requirements, where is there room for citizens to have input and influence? So I will turn that one over to Desiree.
Thanks, Julie, and thanks, Tara. That is a great question. And when I look back at some of our presentation, and I think, wow, there was a whole lot of thresholds and requirements and restrictions, and so I think that's a great question. Where do we have the ability, and where do the residents have the ability to influence? And I think the answer to that question, there is still a lot of room for decision making, certainly around what we're investing in. So when we talk about strategic priorities or we talk about service levels, what we want to invest in and how much we want to invest in. So I certainly appreciate when we get feedback from the community around some of what the city is providing and the services that they're providing. Are they the services that the citizens want? And are they the right level of service? Is it enough? Is it too much? And that will all directly then influence those buckets of dollars within the budget. So I think there certainly is a lot of room there. There's also room for citizens to provide and to influence some of those funding strategies. So you mentioned the self-imposed debt limits, and so there certainly is always some flexibility in terms of, are we, if you think back to that graph, are we coming down quick enough? Should we be limiting our capital expenditures and trying to pay off things quicker? Are there other ways that we should be funding, and what kind of capital priorities should we be looking at? So I think there's certainly, when you think about our asset management, our strategic priorities, our service levels, those all will effectively influence the budget, but they're things that citizens can certainly influence upfront.
Perfect. Thank you, Desiree, and thank you, Tara, for that question. Again, we did go over a lot of information, so if there are additional questions out there, please leverage the Q&A tool. Just as I was saying that, I saw one come in from Don Mitchell. So yes, it's a lengthy one, so I will read it out. And in terms of staffing, which is something like 1/3 of the overall budget, if I interpreted these slides right, third-party work is increasingly a big portion of the work on capital projects, for example. As city staff appear to increasingly more and more responsible administrators, facilitators, less actual in the weeds work on the project technical expertise, we seem to use third parties for project-specific expertise. There's quite a bit here, so I'm going to read it out, but just bear with me. The assumption is that it is more affordable to operate that way. However, the public often hears that consulting style of engagement of work can lead to inefficiency and higher costs to deliver work and projects. Is ongoing analysis ever done whether to use third-party consultants, experts versus engaging in-house staff? Again, the layperson assumption is the carrying cost of staff, benefits, insurance, various required compensation and coverage is the rationale for using third parties. Can you speak to how budgeting examines these types of reviews based on analysis decisions? Thank you for your consideration. That is a great question, John, and I'm going to throw it over to Desiree to respond to.
Thanks, Julie. I'm just kind of, as you were reading it, I was trying to read it at the same time, just making sure I catch everything here. So yes, thank you, Dawn. That's a great question. And we often get a question from council around the use of third parties and contracted services. So I can maybe provide a bit of input around some of our process in terms of when we make decisions to use third parties and why, and some of maybe the rationale in terms of doing that. Because as with anyone, third-party contractors, the work has to be managed and managed appropriately, and we have to pick the right supplier up at front. So I think you alluded to it in the question in terms of project-specific expertise. So, and maybe I can start out. I'm just thinking back to one of the slides that Lana had, which was actually operating, and I know you reference capital as well. But in the operating side, where we do also use some third-party contracted services, particularly things like snow plowing and snow removal, and some of our solid waste services we do have in there. But I believe that the total category, and I think this included supplies and materials, was something like about 15% of our total budget. So I think, as you say in your question, we do use more perhaps in some of our capital projects that are the one-offs. But I think, to your point, in terms of project-specific expertise, that is one of the criteria that we look at as a starting point. So do we have that specific expertise in-house? And if we don't have that proper expertise, then we need to look outside. So that is certainly one of the factors that we look at. The other factor that we do look at is our workload, is workload. And I think you've sort of referenced that as well in the question. Sometimes we just don't have the capacity in-house to do some of these things. And I would say, without looking at the specific details over the last few months in terms of usage of contracted services, but I think about a lot of our staff over the last 6 months that have been pulled away to do things we never had on the work plan in terms of the pandemic. And yet we still had day-to-day operations and other capital initiatives that were underway that also needed to be addressed. So sometimes it is workload, even if it's not sort of that expertise requirement. One of the things that we do also look at, and I would say this is probably more prevalent in operating than in capital, because operating tends to be the recurring expenses. But we have had situations in the past where we have used external support to the point where we're using them for 1,800 hours. And I use that number because our standard hours are like 1,820 standard work hours. So if we start to be hiring that kind of expertise to the equivalent of a full-time staff person, then we need to stop and look and say, why are we not hiring that expertise and doing that business case? And I can tell you, we have had examples of that in the past where we have done just that, where we've actually turned around and said, no, let's start looking for this expertise, this skill set, and bring it in-house. So that's certainly something else we can look at. The other factor that we look at when we're hiring is, and as you said, it tends to be project-specific expertise, and it tends to be sort of the one-off requirements that we need. But we also need to take a look at what happens when that work is done and the third party leaves. And do we have that knowledge transfer in order for staff to continue with the recurring costs going forward? Because we don't want to be in a situation where we bring somebody in and they have all the knowledge level on that initiative, and then they walk out the door and we don't have anything, and we're then in a position where we have to continue hiring. So that's always part of when we're looking at bringing other folks in, that it's either just a one-off, very scope-specific piece of work, or that we have a process as part of that contract where there will be a knowledge transfer over to the staff that can then can move ahead with that skill set in terms of operating the asset or whatever that piece of work might be. And then I think the last comment I would just say to that is, and perhaps where we have had some challenges in the past, we've gone back and looked at this factor, is how we're managing those contracts. So it's important from a procurement standpoint that, number one, we are hiring the right type of person. And I think you mentioned, the public often hears the consulting style of the work can lead to inefficiency and higher costs. So that comes right back to when we're actually planning the procurement. What is it that we need at the end of the day? What type of style will fit in for that type of work? And really laying out what those procurement requirements are, and then putting those in and evaluating those as part of the request for proposal, so that we're doing everything we can to get that right fit and that right style in up front. And then as we move through the work, we need to make sure we've got the in-house staff properly managing that. So no different than we would have a manager or a director managing their staff within the organization. There is a requirement to manage those external contracts as well, to make sure that they are doing exactly what was required as part of the request for proposal. So I can tell you, we certainly do a lot of business cases around those. When we're doing the budget process, there is a piece where we are looking at what's included in our contracted service category, and we work with finance and the departments to have those discussions to make sure that we are carrying out the work in the most efficient manner, and certainly from a financial standpoint, that it's effective and efficient.
Perfect. Thank you, Desiree. Donald, I hope that answers your question, and I thank you very much for asking it. It led to a great discussion. I just want to remind people, if you are calling in and you have a question you would like to pose, to use *6, and then that will trigger the raise hand function and will enable your audio so you can ask your question. Okay, perfect. I see your response. Excellent. Thank you, Don. Just a reminder to everyone in attendance as well that we do have a survey live on our Get Involved Kingston page. So Get Involved Kingston is the city's public engagement online site, and you can access it at www.getinvolved.cityofkingston.ca. And the survey is open until this Friday, November 13th at 4 p.m. I see we've gone through a few questions. There's no additional questions at this point in time, but we have covered a lot of information, and we have some experts in this room who are ready and able to answer your questions. Just as we're waiting for additional questions to filter in, I actually had one for Desiree, and it was about the credit rating. And it's my understanding that the city works with partners to compile the information for that credit rating. So if you could just provide a little more information about the process that the city goes through for that AA, or really the AA credit rating is excellent, but the process that goes into the review process for that credit rating.
Sure. Thanks, Julie Lee. So it's actually quite a comprehensive process. And while for us, it's kind of probably a 2 to 3 month process in terms of working with Standard & Poor's to provide information, Standard & Poor's actually continues to review information from the city throughout the year. So they're on our website. They're looking at council reports. Every now and then they may call Lana or I with a question or two during the year. But usually sometime midsummer, they send us a request, a very long request for a lot of information. So they look at things like, they take a look at our budgets. They will look at our budget to actual reports that go to council to see what our budget performance has been like. So are we within budget? Have our budgets been appropriate? Do we have any challenges with surpluses or deficit? And I can tell you, going through the credit rating just recently this year, they had a lot of questions on the pandemic effects on the budget and and some of our revenues and expenditures around that. They take a very, very close look at our capital funding models. So they look at our 15-year capital plans, our 15-year reserve fund models. They look at our debt models, the graph that we had up there today. They take a very close look at how that is developed. They look at some of our strategies that we take to council and that we discuss with council throughout the year. And they take a look at things like our cash balances and our liquidity. So that's some of our internal pieces that they look at. They also look at our community as a whole. So they look at some of the economic development within our community. And the executive director from KEDCO is part of this review. And has some long conversations with them as well around the previous year's activity from an economic development standpoint. Have we had any businesses that have closed? Have we had any businesses that have expanded? Have we had new businesses coming in? What's the interest in the city and the community from an investor's perspective? And they take a look at our community makeup. So as I said, certainly the fact that we have a very high institutional base that helps us weather some economic challenges and certainly has helped us weather, I think, even through some of this pandemic with a lot of public sector jobs. So they take a look at that and our ability to be able to react to some of those challenges. Once a year, they actually do come and visit with us. This year, obviously, it was electronic meeting, but they meet with both Lana and I. They meet with Donna Gillespie from KEDCO, and they meet with our CAO, and just get an idea as to some of the information that they've already reviewed, if they have any questions from that. And they also look forward, so they're looking into the future year and looking to see whether or not there's any challenges coming up. And I didn't put on the slide, I said an AA credit rating, but it's an AA credit rating with a stable outlook, which means that we are stable going forward. They don't see any risk or concern that there would be a potential in the next year or two that we would be going down in a credit rating. If we had a positive outlook, that would be saying that they are starting to think about moving our credit rating up. And certainly with some of our capital funding strategies that we have in place right now and the higher debt that we have reaching that green line, as we start to come down from that green line, we will start to be having some conversations that potentially maybe getting that credit rating up. But as long as we're up around that green line, we can at least hope that we will remain stable. And so they certainly aren't just looking at the current year; they're also looking at what's coming in the next 1 or 2 years as well.
Perfect, thank you. Just a reminder to everyone in attendance that the Q&A function is at the bottom. So if you do have any questions about today's presentation, you can pose your question just by clicking on it and typing it in, and we will get to all the questions that we are able to today. Also, again, a reminder that if you're calling in and you have a question, you can press *6, and that will trigger the raise hand function, and we will enable your audio and take your question. I also want to just give another reminder that we do have a survey open on our Get Involved Kingston platform, and it closes this Friday at 4 p.m. So please do take the time to visit Get Involved Kingston and complete the survey on the 2021 budget. We do have a question from Tara, and she is asking, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused unique challenges. Both the federal and provincial governments are carrying multi-billion-dollar deficits to support and protect citizens in these particularly challenging times. What flexibility is there at the municipal level to spend additional funds without raising taxes and imposing user fees to balance the budget? So I am going to look to Desiree and Lana, and Lana's unmuted. It's all yours, Lana.
All right. Thanks, Julie Lee. So as per legislation, municipalities must have a balanced budget. So there's not a lot of flexibility in the 2021 budget without raising taxes or user fees to cover off additional expenses. What we typically do is we look at where can we reduce services and or costs in that situation. The 2020 year is a little bit more unique in that we are projecting about a $9.3 million deficit for the end of the year. However, the provincial and federal governments have provided safe restart monies to help offset those. I'll turn it over to Des if she has anything else that she wanted to add, but hopefully that answered your question.
She knows me so well. I always have something to add. So no, thanks, Lana. That was a great answer. And I think the only thing that I would add is, as Lana mentioned, the feds and the province have provided the Safe Restart funding. And phase one of that funding certainly wasn't enough to cover off some of our challenges. And so initially, council, a few months back actually, looked at a number of other strategies in terms of balancing our budget by the end of the year. So I should probably prelude by saying that our objective is to have a balanced budget by the end of 2020, using some of these various strategies to address the $9.3 million that Lana had referenced. So a couple of things that council had looked at, we certainly had looked at the ability to defer some of our capital programs. We looked at the opportunity to use some of our reserve funds that perhaps had been set aside for things like capital and use those funds instead to balance the budget. So there was a few things like that we looked at. As Lana said, we had a $9.3 million challenge that we're starting with. And I think it's important to say, while we had about $22 million of challenge on the revenue side, we found almost $10 million through savings on our expense side. So departments have worked diligently to minimize any costs where they could, and to reduce some of the costs so that we could come in under budget with the expense side to help offset some of those revenues. So between those initiatives and the Safe Restart funding, I would say the third piece is there is a phase 2 to the Safe Restart funding, and council just at the last meeting approved staff to put in an application to request some additional funds that would help against the 9.3 million, and that actually just went in on Friday. So we'll be waiting to hear back from that. So I think long answer between the two of us. But what I see for 2021 is that things, and I see you say, Tara, in your next piece that you're thinking particularly expenses related to housing and climate change. Those are still on the table, and those will be considered in the 2021 budget. So we are hoping to address the pandemic related challenges without making any significant changes to those initiatives. Part of the report that has gone to council is around some of the initiatives and the strategic priorities. And I would say that the only things from a significant standpoint that have changed in terms of what we will be financing from the budget in 2021, we have deferred a couple of initiatives where they rely on other external parties. So for instance, there was an initiative around a downtown campus with St. Lawrence College. The college certainly is dealing with their own challenges with the pandemic right now. So until they're prepared for that to come back on their table, that would be put on hold. We've also deferred a few projects that in the transportation area where it just doesn't make sense at this point to move forward. And one of those certainly would be transit. Our transit ridership is down, I think, somewhere around 30 or 40% of what the norm would be right now. And so some of our initiatives to expand and enhance transit are on hold till we can really get a handle on what 2021 is going to look like and what is our transit demand and service going to actually look like as we move into 2021 and 2022.
Thank you, Desiree, and thank you, Tara, for that great question, and Lana for your response to it as well. So I am just going to remind everyone that we do have our survey on Get Involved Kingston, and it's open until this Friday at 4 p.m. So please do take the time to go there and complete the survey, submit your feedback. On that project page, you'll also see the timelines for this engagement, and there is also the opportunity to follow the project. So for instance, whenever we report out about this session, as well as the results from the survey. If you're following the project page, you'll be notified when that information goes live. So I am not seeing any additional questions coming in at this point. We are going to give it a couple of minutes, because if you do have a question about any of the information that we've covered today, we want to give you the opportunity to ask it. And if there are none, then we will move on to the next slide, where it will be an assessment of this engagement and how you feel that it went, which I would ask you to stick around for, because it is important. We're always looking to improve these online sessions. So if you do have any questions about any of the materials that have been gone over by Lana or Desiree, I invite you to ask them now. And I will just remind you, if you have friends or family or colleagues who were unable to make it to today's session, the session is available on the City of Kingston's YouTube channel. And there's also another session happening this Thursday, which you can still RSVP for. Again, it will be held on Zoom, and there will be the presentation, similar format, presentation followed by a Q&A period. Okay, so seeing no additional questions, I am going to move on to the next slide, where again, you will have the opportunity to complete a poll to tell us how we did. And I think I speak on behalf of the entire project team when I thank you for all the excellent questions that you have put forward. So you will see a poll appear on your screen. And I would ask you that you just take the time to complete it, so again, we can improve our process. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of this session, technology problems, they happen. So I was unable to launch the poll, but I have a colleague who has assisted in that department. So I please ask you to complete the poll and let us know how we did, and we will work to continue to improve our process. And again, thank you for taking part of your morning to spend it with us to learn about the City of Kingston budgets. So I'm just consulting with our IT support staff. So we are still waiting for a couple people to complete the poll. So if you could please do so, that would be much appreciated. Again, it's an opportunity for us to improve these sessions so that they're all the more enjoyable for you in the future. So just a couple of other housekeeping items as we wait for a few individuals to complete that poll. A reminder to visit the Get Involved Kingston page on the city budget, where you can sign up to receive notifications about this project and where we will be posting the reporting out document on this session, as well as the other engagements that we've been having. Perfect. I've been told that everyone has completed the poll, and I thank you for that. And again, our project team thanks you for joining us this morning and taking the time to learn about the City of Kingston budgets and for asking some really excellent questions. We hope this was as meaningful for you as it was for us. And thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.